Hello, welcome to Contemplations, and I'm here with Hugo and I'm Josh, and we are here today to talk to you about whether democracy is important for development.
Right, and so that kind of question, I wanted to tie that together with the discussion yesterday that we had about Acemoglu and Robinson and their theory of development, which is the theory of institutions. So that question, whether you need democracy to develop, that by that we mean economic development, right? So things like GDP, but not just that, maybe a human development index, and you've got several things like that you can take as a measurement of some kind of development. But what we mean is economic well-being and well-being in general, right? And so yesterday we went over that theory of institution of Acemoglu and Robinson, and what they have is a system of institutions. They separate institutions into four categories. Well, they have political institutions and economic institutions, and then they have extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. And of course, inclusive institutions are the good ones, extractive are the bad ones. And you've got a bit of an overview of them that we showed yesterday as well. And so, in short, what they say, what Acemoglu and Robinson say, is that that countries are poor because they have extractive economic institutions, and they also say that you can't have inclusive economic institutions if you don't have inclusive political institutions, or if you do have it like that, then it's gonna in time regress back to this situation of all exclusive institutions and no inclusive ones.
Yeah, so if you have a combination, it's going to go back to a point of stability where they're all inclusive or all exclusive,
Yes.
extractive even.
Yeah. And so that the theory says that extractive institutions are bad, inclusive institutions are good, and inclusive institutions are good, among other things, because that's how you get development. You get development from innovation and from entrepreneurship, and those things you can get if you have inclusive economic institutions. And so that's the goal. And so the question now is, if you need inclusive political institutions to get inclusive economic institutions, well, what are these inclusive political institutions? Well, as we touched on yesterday a little bit, Acemoglu and Robinson kind of imply that democracy is it. Democracy means inclusive political institutions, but they rarely say that out loud. They rarely say it openly like that. It's usually something that they indicate by saying something different. But I think that from their lectures and from their talks, when you listen to them, you can actually get quite a good idea that this is what they mean. And I'm gonna give you a couple of quotes to show what I mean when I say that. So, for example, Acemoglu says that inclusive political institutions, quote, create a more equal distribution of power, sometimes referred to as pluralism, and they don't let anyone have absolute control over the power of the state. And so that's what he's talking about. And usually, if you say something like that, what you mean is democracy. You have some people that would say something like that but mean something else, but that wouldn't be the typical view. And I would say that Acemoglu and Robinson are the very typical view of things. So
Sure.
I would say that that's a fair inference to make. And so then you have they also say that democracy is not always synonymous with inclusive political institutions, but they don't say that openly either. But they sometimes say that if you have democratic elections, you're not always going to end up with inclusive economic institutions, which is what they imply elsewhere in their theory by saying that these two things correlate,
parcel,
right?
Yeah.
And right, and so in their book, in Why Nations Fail, they have an example of something being democratic while not being really good in that way that they think in having inclusive institutions, both economic and political. So I'm going to quote from page 377. While Colombia has a long history of democratic elections, it does not have inclusive institutions. Instead, its history has been marred by violations of civil liberties, extrajudicial executions, violence against civilians, and civil war. Not the sort of outcomes we expect from democracy. And so that's what I think Robinson says. Maybe Acemoglu, I'm not sure here, but actually that's what both of them say, because that's directly from the book, not from a talk that one of them has given. So that's what they say. So they say that's not something that you would expect from democracy. Violations of civil liberties, and these are the bad things that they list. But you have to ask that question: why would you not expect that from a democracy? I mean, democracy is a way to select rulers, a different way than a monarchy, a different way than an aristocracy, but there's nothing in just the pure kind of system of democracy that would prevent things like that. Often what we have connected with the idea of democracy in our common parlance is that together with like free and fair elections and this way of selecting rulers, you also have other kind of protection of personal and civil rights, which can be then said as kind of belonging to this idea of democracy in some versions of the word, but they're not necessarily kind of tied to it in the proper way.
Yeah, I would agree there, because although I'm very much pro-democracy, I think that the guarantee of civil liberties comes from the political institution, in using the terms that are used in this theory. So although these civil liberties might change, it's about almost the political culture of the country in question that determines which civil liberties are guaranteed, which are not. And it doesn't seem particularly tied to democracy per se.
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say was that you can have everyone voting and selecting their rulers by majority, and then that ruler having that majoritarian legitimacy doing something that goes against the human rights. Maybe it goes against the human rights of some minority, maybe even the majority, but still it has that democratic mandate, right? So that can happen, that does happen. And so if you contrast democracy with a tyranny of some sort, then you can say, okay, in a democracy at least, like, there's some mechanism to affect change that is more clear than in the case of tyranny. But you wouldn't expect those negative things that they talk about not to be there just because you have a lot of people voting and selecting their rulers by majority.
Yeah, there are checks and balances in theory, but they're not always as effective in practice as you would want them to be. And there are lots of cases where perfectly democratically elected governments do things that a very large section of society might disagree with, and there's no real way of redressing that grievance, or even saying, okay, well, perhaps 40% of the population doesn't agree. Well, so long as 50 or 60% are fine with it, then it goes ahead. But that's a very kind of problematic, if I hate using that word, but it's not very good for promoting societal cohesiveness, which is very important for actually maintaining stability and therefore economic growth. So in many ways, the manifestations of democratic systems at the minute may not actually be so well connected to the economy as you might otherwise think.
Yeah, and I think that they have this tendency to connect democracy with all these nice things in politics, like the upholding of civil liberties, lack of violence against civilians and things like that, just because they like democracy and they like those things or not having those things based on
Mm-hmm.
what that is. And so they connect these things together and say, okay, these are all one bundle of things that you can have together, and then you have to have together. But I think that's just a bit of ideology seeping in because that's what you would like it to be, but
Mm-hmm.
there's kind of little reason to presume that up front if you don't then go into it and explain why you think that is the case.
It certainly makes sense in theory to me, at the very least, but in practice, I find that there's quite a different scale of democracy. On the one hand, you have things like the Swiss system, where they have direct votes on specific political issues, and although that's not ideal, you had it with the face covering ban, where it was like 51% voted in favour and 49% against, which is a very huge split. And the same thing with Brexit,
Yeah.
where it was 51 and I think it's 52 and 48. I can't remember exactly, but it was very close. And splitting society down these divisive lines isn't necessarily very helpful, especially when you have a formal vote on something. It forces people to pick a side
Yeah.
on an issue where otherwise they might be more willing to entertain other ideas. And just in pitting people against one another, it's certainly not necessarily beneficial in that respect.
Yeah,
But
no, I agree completely. And but what they then talk about in Why Nations Fail is they talk a bit more about Latin America, and so they say, quote, while the democracy emerging in Latin America is in principle diametrically opposed to elite rule, and in rhetoric and in action it tries to redistribute rights and opportunities away from at least a segment of the elite, its roots are firmly based in extractive regimes in two senses. First, inequities persisting for centuries under extractive regimes make voters in newly emerging democracies vote in favor of politicians with extreme policies. And then they continue a bit further. Well, there's just one point I wanted to stop at that point, because that's kind of that's kind of a complicated way of saying that democracy that democracy produces the results that you want only under specific circumstances, and other than that it doesn't, because they say, okay, that there is democracy in the formal sense that there's elections, leaders or rulers are selected by those elections, so that process works to a large extent. But they say, okay, this hasn't led to all these good things that we associate with it that they mentioned before, and it actually never challenged these extractive political institutions, extractive economic institutions, sorry. And so that's something that's something that's quite interesting, because again, because they say at other points that you have this convergence of inclusive or exclusive institutions, and that if you have inclusive political institutions, you are more likely to over time get inclusive economic institutions as well. And so if then they say this and say, okay, if you have these inclusive political institutions, the democracy that is nice, well, then in some contexts you don't really get that progress that you want, which is the inclusive economic institutions. And so they then explain it, but if that doesn't fit into that theory, if that theory can't explain it in its own right, then it's not something that would be that good to kind of judge development by, right?
I think I kind of followed. Like, would you be able to summarize that a bit?
Yes, so that you can have democracy, and then that can spur the development of inclusive economic institutions as well. But then you can also have situations where that doesn't happen, and if that doesn't happen, then they have a way of explaining that away, but that doesn't. Well, that still takes a bit of legitimacy away from their theory of saying, okay, if you have democracy, then over time you're going to probably get inclusive economic institutions.
To me, it's probably my scientific background, but if there are so many exceptions to their theory, is it really a good theory in the first place? Because the utility of a theory is its explanatory power, And if you've got the exceptions of Latin America and China occupying places where they said people tend not to occupy, doesn't that suggest that perhaps this theory isn't as all-encompassing as it otherwise might be?
I mean, I think it would be fair to say that you can have a theory that explains most things that you want to explain, but doesn't explain all of them, and that can be a usable theory, even though you have to have that caveat that it's not perfect, and there are going to be things that are not explained, even though the general tendency is correct. And I don't know if that actually applies in this case or not.
I'm kind of maybe being a bit charitable, but I can see as like a general trend, or when you generalize like a multi-country level, it seems to be that they're getting at something. If you have the inclusive economic and political systems, they seem to reinforce one another, and likewise with the opposite. And that certainly seems reasonable, but at the same time, I feel like just for it must just be my scientific background, because if there are exceptions to a rule that are very stringent and obvious, and I feel like this isn't necessarily very useful in its explanation.
Right. No, I can see where you're coming from, but at the same time, sadly, that's not the standard that you can uphold in a lot of social sciences and these areas where you can't easily isolate different variables and then remove them from the equation altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly understand that when you're looking at things from a multi-country level, there's such a great degree of complexity that you kind of have to generalize, otherwise it's just going to be so much information that it's going to be beyond comprehension.
Yeah.
And there's got to be some degree of simplification and making general rules. So I do get that, but
and I would say that it's even kind of legit to say, okay, I've got a theory, and then someone says, okay, but this example disproves your theory, and you say, okay, that's not the case. My theory still applies, but there is this kind of condition to it, and you amend your theory with that condition, and you kind of keep adding conditions on it, and then it becomes a bit convoluted, but it can still be a largely valid theory, even though it's got a lot of these conditions that have to be met, or that have to be not met, or have to come together for it to work.
But I do feel that there's a certain number of caveats before you've got to say, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't really work that well.
Yeah. No, you can take that from both sides. I think you can be more charitable to it and less charitable, and you can say, okay, this has some explanatory power, but it's not great at predicting things, and you can say, okay, this is the opposite. This has these exceptions, and therefore you can't really use it.
I think I'm looking for a standard that's probably not really possible, is it? Like in science, you can just say this is caused by this, and that's that. Like there's no debate. That's the way it is, and that's kind of what I look for in a theory. And perhaps it's not appropriate here, especially when the number of factors and things are very vast.
Yeah, that's generally the problem of talking about aggregates of people, and each that you have multiple people, multiple actors, and each of them can act different way, got different motivations, and like it's very hard to compartmentalize things together in neat boxes that then you can compare against one another. So that is definitely a huge drawback in social science, that you can't really do those things very well.
But to bring things back to democracy, I think that their theory applies to some democracies better than others, as far as I see it, in that perhaps a liberal democracy where there are constitutional rights that are instituted, and these provide guarantees for citizens, and they know they have a certain amount of security of their political position. You can kind of make the argument more strongly for that, whereas in certain other democracies where there's perhaps not as many formalized rights, where things can change very quickly depending on the mood and the amount of political power of the ruling party, then the utility of democracy as something that promotes stability for an economy to flourish is kind of iffy, I feel.
Yeah. No, I agree with that definitely. I would specify that though, because what they say, what they yeah, so that it would be fair. What they often say is that you have this bundle of things, and big part of it is democracy, and those other parts are these constitutional protections and these other institutions apart from democracy that form this kind of good bundle of things we actually want. And so if I want to challenge that a little bit, because then you have you can have that bundle of constitutional protections which are just they could be rephrased as limitations on what the state or the government can do, right? So you could say that this is not something. This is a list of things that the government is prohibited from doing against the people, no matter what the regime is, right? So you've got something like that with, for example, Magna Carta, which was a list of rights on behalf of some people, but it was more saying what the ruler can't do, right? And so that's in my opinion what it is, what's the essence of it. And so then it doesn't matter if it's what the democratic majority can't do, or if it's what the aristocracy can do, or if it's what the monarchy can't do. It doesn't really matter that much, in my opinion. So, and the important thing is that you have these kind of protections, or at least something that claims that they can't do this, and that they actually are afraid of or not follow that.
But the Magna Carta is not even a product of democracy per se.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's weird that they highlight democracy as this essential thing, but then they also have all these caveats to say, well, it's actually got to be constitutional.
That was my thing. They don't talk about Magna Carta. That's what I brought in. I wanted to say, I wanted to use it as an example of those constitutional protection, that they don't have to be against democracy, right?
Sure.
They can be to protect you against any kind of ruler. That's what they are. And so if you don't have to have it, if it doesn't have to be bundled together with democracy, then you could have a hypothetical situation in which you have these kind of good thing, all these good things that they say are nice, the rule of law, protection of individual rights, private property, and things like that. But you don't have that bundled together with democracy, because you have those protections against the ruler, which just happens not to be democratic, right? And so that's what I was getting at.
But would you not find that if there's no ability to change these guarantees with society as it changes as well, would it not be that if these things were preserved as they were, I feel like I'm going to annoy some Americans here, but if these things stay the same for too long, I would feel like it might become somewhat more irrelevant as time goes on. And I mean, there are elements of the American Constitution which have really stood the test of time, and fair enough, but are they going to apply in 1,000 years' time? I feel like there's got to be some exchange between the rulers and the people they're ruling to report what these changes need to be.
Oh yeah.
There's got to be some degree of exchange, and I feel like democracy seems to be a productive way of doing that, if not perfect all the time.
No, I think that like what you said is correct in my opinion. Like you can't have something that you write down and then that just becomes the best thing to do for another 1,000 years. Like that's not going to happen. But at the same time, that you don't necessarily want to do that, right? You don't necessarily need to do that. I find it a bit weird, like not that you're saying it, but this in general, this idea of like planning out your regime or your state for 1,000 years. Like that's like I don't necessarily, like, that's not necessarily my priority, right? My priority is to say, okay, it can this be a good place for a couple of generations to kind of to grow and to develop as best as they can, right? And then if you take it from a too long of a perspective, then you can't really focus on anything. You can't really take anything for granted. You can't really plan for anything, because everything just becomes too uncertain, and so you become too restricted by that uncertain future in what you can actually do today.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, in that if you're trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, you're suggesting by implication that you have a concrete understanding of the current situation, which means that your predictions for the future are predicated on something that you probably almost certainly are going to get wrong in some way.
Yeah.
Like, it's just too complicated to comprehend, and therefore future-proofing something for a long time is very, very difficult. And although there's certainly good attempts at doing so, I feel like it may not always be as useful to do so. And there are certainly things like freedom of speech where I feel like it's fair enough that that's never not going to be useful, but there are other cases of kind of constitutional law that may need to change in the future, depending on what it entails.
But even the idea of freedom of speech, that's something that sounds nice, and it's nice, we all agree that's fine. But the meaning of it changes with time. Like, freedom of speech means something else today than it meant 200 years ago, just because of the way that we communicate is very different from back then in a lot of ways, and the technology that allows that is different. And so the application, it creates a lot of gray areas or conflicts of different rights, where freedom of speech conflicts with some other rights equally as legitimate, maybe, that have that you have to resolve somehow. And you can say, okay, I'm gonna with all of these bad, like, with all of these situations, I'm just gonna say free speech takes the precedence, and but then that's not a good standard for everything, because then if you go too far, you go into other people's rights in other ways.
Yeah,
right?
There's got to be some degree of a hierarchy of rights, in a sense, in that when you're making a trade-off, it's there's got to be some weighing up of which is more valuable than the other. Like, I'm very much pro free speech, but I'm not in favour of inciting violence, and I'm happy to have that limitation on my speech, because I believe that preventing people from being violently attacked is probably more important, funnily enough.
Yes, so things like that can be one example, but you've got loads, and you've got new examples like this coming in when new technology comes in, when, like, if there's no social media, and then social media comes into the picture, then you have a couple of new dilemmas like this that you need to resolve in some way, and you can do that always in favor of free speech over above all. But that's not really, like, that can turn out well, but it might not, right? So depends.
I think, although I have strong principles about these sorts of things, I think taking a pragmatic approach and not being like a fanatic about any one thing, like you've got to weigh up the consequences of everything and see if it applies in the same kind of spirit of the law. I know that's a very loose term, and I've probably lifted it from somewhere, but like, the spirit of free speech is that you're able to communicate ideas amongst people, and it's not necessarily to be abusive to people or call violence towards people. That's not really in the spirit of it, although where we draw the line is like more of a pragmatic consideration than something that's idealistic. Like, how do we define where it should be drawn? I feel like this has gone on to a bit of a tangent now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah. So let's get back to democracy and development, because yeah, we get. I was just trying to figure out how we got there, but I don't really know. Anyway, so what Acemoglu and Robinson say is that in that kind of square that we showed yesterday, you can take one path, but you can't really take the other, and that the path that you can't take is to create inclusive economic institutions first, and then expect inclusive political institutions to follow. That's what they say doesn't really work, and that's what they say is essentially modernization theory. And so, what is modernization theory? Well, modernization theory is something that was developed, or the godfather of it is Samuel Lipset. And so that's this guy. If you scroll down a bit, that's there. And so he studied this, he dedicated his life to it, and the gist of what he came up with was that democracy is more likely to develop in wealthier countries, or that democracy and wealth are kind of correlated in some way, right? And so he like his writing is quite extensive and interesting, but it's also quite old, and so other authors later came to respond to what he had said. And so one response to him is Przeworski and Lemongi, and they build on his theories, and they kind of specify them more. They made them a bit more narrow and concrete. And so what they find is that the correlation between economic development and democracy is strong, but that's not because economic development would cause democracy to develop, as Lipset would say or would imply, but that democracies may be established independently of economic development and then be more likely to survive in developed countries, right? And so that's kind of an important distinction, that it doesn't mean that if you have a wealthy country, then democracy is going to develop, but that if democracy develops and there happens to be a wealthy country, then it's more likely to stay and not be overturned.
Yeah, and I'm immediately reminded of the difficulties that pro-democracy people had in kind of feudal Russia. So under the Tsar, they were struggling to make ends meet. They didn't have a very good economic situation, so they were just like, well, why would I care about my civil liberties when I can't even feed myself? Like, it's a product of having some degree of economic wealth that you begin to care about these sorts of things, and it's kind of reminiscent of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, although I don't necessarily subscribe to that model. It's something similar to that, where people have more base needs than being democratically represented, so it makes sense that their more practical economic concerns would come first, and then a democracy might be sustained by having a flourishing economy.
I mean, that could be one explanation of it, and I'm sure there's something to it, but at the same time, you have to have a combination of different factors, because it makes sense to me that you'd want to be, that at some point you would gain this kind of desire to be politically represented in some way, but democracy is a very specific application of it. So again, that's just to say that's not the only factor that's going to be there, but that's definitely something that is important for it. I agree. And so what Przeworski and Lemongi say is, quote, democracy is more likely to survive in a growing economy with less than $1,000 US dollars per capita income than in a country with an income between $1,000 US dollars and $2,000 US dollars that declines economically. If they succeed in generating development, democracies can survive even in the poorest nations. And so that's what they say, right? So Lipset is kind of right, but not really, because he says democracy is going to develop somewhere because of wealth, but he's wrong in that. He's just overgeneralized it, and the narrower thesis, according to them, holds that democracy is more likely to survive in wealthier countries if it happens to come about. Right?
That seems reasonable to me, yeah.
And so another influential paper, but a bit outdated, that touches on this is by Rivera Batiz in 2002, and he says, quote, "Our results suggest that democracy is a key determinant of growth, but only insofar as it is associated with improved governance. In cases where democracy is not associated with improved governance, it will have very little impact on growth. And in authoritarian countries where the quality of governance is high, growth is likely to also be at high levels." So that's a very important kind of point in that discussion, and something that I was kind of hinting at before, is that what you actually need to develop is good governance, is good policies, and that's against what Acemoglu and Robinson are saying in some sense, because they mention it specifically, but also they implied the thing that I'm implying here at other points. So it's not clear what they actually mean at times.
Sure.
But this distinction between democracy and between good governance is kind of important in this, and yes, and so I don't know if that sounds reasonable to you, or if the distinction is something that seems important.
I think that there's a certain amount of influence of democracy to me, like. It seems that it's kind of like what Churchill said about capitalism. It's kind of the least worst system.
He said it about democracy.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
Oh, in which case it applies even more then.
I think he didn't say that at all, but it is thought of him. It is attributed to him as having said that about democracy.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me coming up with it, but someone said that, and I feel that that's kind of true of democracy. I have plenty of problems with how it manifests in the modern day, but in principle I believe that people should be able to have some say in how their lives are ruled over. I think that there's got to be some kind of coordination between people cooperating, because it's clear that being a sole person, like if you lived in the middle of nowhere just living on your own, your life is going to be a lot harder than if you cooperate with a society. But if you're cooperating, you've got to coordinate in some way, and it seems like a democratic system is quite effective at coordinating that, even though some people might not always be happy. On the whole, it seems to come up with better results than more authoritarian systems.
So you would say that democracy correlates with the good governance just because of that, like that would be the summary of what you.
Yeah, because the way that you define good governance is governance that serves the people who make up the governed. I would say, like, it's good governance isn't necessarily something that's objective and we can say that's good governance. Like it's what people want from their own government.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But I think what I meant and what they mean more here is is that good governance means governance that produces good results in terms of economic development and the improvement in living standards and this type of thing, right? And so not necessarily implementing the policies that the majority would call for. That's not it, because that can be something else, right? You can't expect the majority of people to know a lot about the majority of topics. Like, that's not reasonable, right? So like usually people know a lot about one specific thing, but almost nothing about everything else. And that's fine. That's how you all tend to operate. But then you can't expect most people to know about most things, right? And so,
sure, but people know about their own life. I would say most people know about their own lives better than anyone. But in voting in a self-interested way, that I'm not sure how much I believe it, but I would say I'm more inclined to than not. When everyone pursues their own self-interest in voting behaviour, then it's quite reflective of how things could actually benefit the majority of people, if that makes any sense.
That I know what you mean, but I think that makes a lot of sense in in the private sphere, in the market, right?
Yeah.
You do things for your own benefit. You can do it for anyone else's benefit. That's fine too. But if you do it for your own benefit, the environment of the society, the market that kind of coordinates together, that kind of forces you or steers you into the way that's beneficial for society as well, if you want it to be beneficial for you. But that's not necessarily what happens in politics, just because of the fact that you have one solution that needs to be applied to everyone, because that's how laws work. If you have democracy that decides on some laws to be passed or not, and then that's one issue, and the other issue is that you don't have what you have is deciding over resources that are not yours, and so that's a problem there too. And so these things can counteract that tendency that it could have, and it does have in other spheres, just because it's politics, just by virtue of being politics.
Yeah, I get the point you're trying to make, in that sometimes if people are voting in their own interest, perhaps they may be saying, well, actually it's in my interest to take my neighbour's house.
Yeah, so exactly. and then you could take 5 neighbours, and they would be like, yes, the 5 of us that were taking your house, and you get your one vote in it. Okay. It's good. It's valuable. But yeah, so this kind of difference between democracy and good governance, that's something that I would like to illustrate with a counterexample of a country that's been successful, more successful than the surrounding countries, but has not been particularly democratic. And so that's Botswana in Africa. So we come back to Africa, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago on
Lovely.
What wasn't at the time the Contemplations. But yeah, so there's an article about Botswana, what Botswana can teach us about political stability. And so I'm going to quote from this. The quote will be a bit long, so I'm going to be reading for a bit, but I think it's worth it. It's a good counterexample. So, it's hard to find a clearer outlier among developing countries than Botswana, a landlocked African country where 40% of government revenue comes from diamond mining and a quarter of adults are HIV positive. Everything taught by a development economics department would suggest the country is set up for failure, but well-executed succession between presidents and the resulting stability and good government has meant success instead. Botswana is possibly the nicest place in Africa, and it is quieter and more stable than, say, Greece. In the entire period since independence, Botswana has not suffered devastating civil wars like those in the Congo or Mozambique, coups such as in Burkina Faso, or ethnic violence and expropriation as seen in Rwanda and Zimbabwe. The country's living standards are comparable to Turkey, Mexico, and South Africa. It has also been sub-Saharan Africa's fastest growing economy for most of the last half-century. The crucial variable is a sound government making well-informed long-term choices. A low population density paired with abundant natural resources provides a reasonable standard of living, even in the absence of administrative genius or favorable conditions, so long as governance provides stability. Political instability can impede development of physical infrastructure and the business environment, transforming good fundamentals into bad outcome. See, for example, Kazakhstan compared to Venezuela. Unfortunately, there are many examples of countries that have tried and failed to achieve good governance in the often chaotic post-colonial context, but these countries followed Western advice as closely as they could, drafting legally impeccable constitutions and recruiting well-educated statesmen, but the results have been mixed at best. Botswana's positive outlier example raises the question of how it has done so well. Good government starts with good leadership. Here is the list of heads of state Botswana over the last 100 years. And then it has the list of its heads. You can find that in the article. And most of them have the same last name. So given these clear personal, political, and familial ties between the heads of state, it seems that Botswana is actually an unofficial adoptive monarchy around the old royal family, quite similar to the case of the Roman Empire, where the head of state picks the successor and gives him the junior position. In the paradigm of contemporary political science, such an arrangement is usually taken as a negative sign. We are used to thinking of political dynasties and close alliances among insiders to be cardinal signs of corruption. This negative association is at least somewhat the result of cherry-picking. We focus on political dynasties in failed or rogue states, but minimize their very real role in successful Western states. The modern West has its dynasties, most famously the Bushes and the Kennedys. It's an open secret. Statistically, one of the best qualifications for being a US governor is descent from one. And then the article continues, and then at the end, there's another passage that I want to quote. The world, including its functional governments, is a lot more dynastic than we like to admit, and dynasties work a lot better at securing institutional continuity and good government than we like to think. And so that, unquote. And so that's what the article says. So that this example of this de facto monarchy is something that kept Botswana stable and kept Botswana, made Botswana thriving in contrast with the states in similar situations around it, and that this has been something that brought stability and brought good governance, and that the absence of democracy is something that we can see here. And so this is a counterexample to that kind of bundling together of democracy and good governance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't realise that Botswana was quite so fortunate in its economy, but it's a really interesting argument that they pose there.
Yeah, and of course, as we have seen, you have multiple problems and like severe problems in Botswana that's like it's not a paradise on earth or anything like that. It's not comparable to a wealthy Western country, but it's also doing much better in most ways than the countries surrounding it that used to be in a similar position that it once was.
That's indicative of something that is keeping it up, isn't it? Because if the countries around it have failed, they're the ones that share the conditions in which it could have also failed.
Yeah, and it's not like all the other countries have particularly failed or something.
Yeah, I think failed is the wrong word.
But it's they have Botswana has been more successful than those in most ways. Right, and so if we kind of take that into account, that it doesn't have to be kind of bundled together, democracy and good governance, and can be separated, then what does that mean? And does actually Acemoglu and Robinson, do they talk about it? So what they say is that for economic development, you need one, a state, and two, wide distribution of political power, and that's kind of the preconditions for having inclusive economic institutions, and then of course inclusive political institutions. And so he would say that means democracy, but we have reasons to think that doesn't have to be it. So you could rephrase that to be more generally. So a state, you could say that it just means institutions reliably enforcing property rights, and then that second thing, wide distribution of political power, it's just saying a mechanism against the gradual corruption of those institutions, right? And so if you generalize it like that, and you generalize it in the direction of what do you actually want those things to, like, the functions that you want them to perform, you arrive at the conclusion that they don't have to be democratic at all, that it doesn't have to be tied to democracy, even though it often is and can be, right? And so the problem is that if you assume that democracy is the only solution in that direction that you want to go, then you start to ignore the drawbacks of democracy, and you kind of start to forgetting about what you actually want. See, you actually want something else, and then democracy is the way that you get there. And if you think that's the only way to get there, that becomes an end in itself.
Well, I mean, I'm very much pro-democracy, so I don't know how I necessarily feel about this information. So basically, England should be ruled by the Queen, and then we'd be better off. That's basically what you're saying, right?
No, I'm saying that if you want good governance, that then good incentives are the key to that, right? So and some of those good incentives can be created by democracy, as in the pressure on the rulers to do some things that are not entirely opposed to what the people want, because otherwise they tend to get voted out, even if not always. Then that's some kind of pressure, and so that's kind of a type of incentives that I'm talking about. But you can have those. But those incentives are key, right? It's not, of course, yeah. It's not the process itself. It's just that process is one type of those incentives. And so you can have a counterexample, and one of those we talked about in Botswana, like stable monarchies or aristocracies. And if you have in those if you have some stable aristocracies or stable monarchies, you can have an institutional setup in those systems that actually creates those good incentives that you want to create good governance, right? And so just have one book that talks about it a little bit. Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about how monarchy is still bad, but it's better than democracy because of the possibility of planning and long-term yields, that the rulers can actually plan ahead and plan for a long period of time, and are not incentivized just to plan for like 4 or 5 years, because that's when they will get voted out or not, and
it's certainly a limitation of democracy. Yeah. I will concede that. Yeah,
and so that limitation of democracy is why, for example, he says that monarchy is better than democracy, and it doesn't lead to some pathologies that he then identifies in society. But that's only just a recommendation for reading. I don't want to dwell on that too much. What I'd also like to recommend is a book by Hans Adam II, which is the ruler of Liechtenstein, and he wrote a book called The State in the Third Millennium. And in that book he talks about Liechtenstein and its constitutional setup, and its in the state and how it's organized. And that's particularly interesting because that's a tiny country, and you have the country. The country is comprised of 13 municipalities, 13 local governments, and each of those villages, each of those municipalities has a right to exit. They can vote on and decide to leave Liechtenstein at any time and join either Switzerland next door or Austria next door, or become an independent state. And they have that in their constitution, that Liechtenstein, the ruler of Liechtenstein is not going to prevent that. They're going to facilitate that if any municipality decides to do so.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and is the only country on earth that actually has that right to exit on a municipal level. And yeah, and so that's interesting because that is it's a monarchy, right? It has some democratic input here and there, but essentially monarchy. But it has this right to exit, which forces the monarch to do the things that its constituents want, because otherwise they could leave at any point. So it actually produces very good results. It has one of the highest GDP per capita in the world, and it's famously a peaceful and nice country.
Is it still a monarchy to this day then?
Oh yeah. This guy who wrote this book, he's the prince.
Oh right, he's got no vested interest whatsoever then. I'm not saying that he's misrepresenting it.
The thing is that the incentives are aligned because he does things, and if he does things wrong, then his constituents will leave for Switzerland.
That's true.
So that forces him to do things right and promote this as well, because like he gets to be the ruler of this, and he gets to be popular. So.
I never knew about that, to be honest.
So that's an interesting thing to kind of to follow up or read. It might be a bit difficult to get this book, but it's definitely possible somewhere. But yeah, so just to conclude this discussion, I think like it's clear that you can have predatory regimes, predatory states of many stripes, right? You can have all types of rulers that create bad governance, that don't really care about the well-being of the population or something other than themselves, and where you have an institutional environment that promotes that and doesn't counteract that force, right? And so in opposition to that, you can have good governance, and that can be democracy, of course, but that has a lot of drawbacks as well. And democracy has some potential in forcing those rulers to do some things, but that potential is very limited because you have loads of other options to maintain, to keep doing things that are not good for the population, even if you're a democracy, and to keep yourself up as the ruler, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's multiple ways to do that, from marketing to doing things like through legal ways.
So long as 51% of the population is more or less on your side and not in direct opposition, you're kind of all right.
And you don't need to do things that are good for at least 50% of the population, but you need to do things that make people think that what you're doing that make at least 51% of the people think that what you're doing is good for the population, right? That's an important difference, I think. Because
I'll concede that.
Because if you're able to do that in some other ways than actually doing what's good for them, then that's a very real drawback of democracy and loophole, let's say, that you have. And so that potential that democracy has is good, but it's very limited because it produces better governance than the worst predatory regimes that you can imagine, of course, but it doesn't produce the best governance by itself. You need some other factors to do that, and so you could do that outside democracy as well. So it might be worth looking at how you can actually get better governance than what democracy can offer at its best, because what it can offer at its best is actually quite limited.
Okay, well, thank you very much for watching, and make sure to go to lotuseaters.com and check out all our content. We have news, we've got the new dispatches, we've got analysis and culture, we've also got the podcast, and you can also check out our premium paid content, which is some of our best content. And thank you very much for watching.